Thank you very much. So 4 years ago in 2019, I talked about a communication-based model of consciousness at this conference. So the main argument is that communication center is processing internal as well as external events. So essentially, we have an assembly of neurons that is analyzing what the body experiences, our body experiences. This assembly is also keeping a record of it and is explaining important events to our peers. So that's essentially what consciousness is about. So this communication center is an add-on. Any organism capable of communicating is, according to this theory, is conscious of its environment. Of course, it provides an evolutionary advantage because we can communicate important events to our peers, and that helps in survival of the members of the group. And of course, information does not have to be communicated orally. You can use various means to convey information. We can use sign language. We could write something on a piece of paper. And of course, for animals, or the insects, the bees, they have the bees dance. They communicate information this way. Now, we would like to talk about qualia. Qualia are instances of subjective conscious experience. So the question is, why do they exist? How do they arise? And of course, will artificial entities be able to experience qualia? And of course, as we all know, this is the seemingly hard problem of consciousness. So my take on this is a quale is a measurement. It's as simple as that. And we are experiencing the mathematical structure of the space we are measuring. Now, back to color. So I'd like to talk about the quale color. What we call color is actually an estimate of object reflectance. So for each object point, you can measure the reflectance function that describes how much light this particular point reflects. So when we look at a scene, we look at the green leaves, the red strawberries. So for the green leaves, they reflect the light mostly in the middle range part of the visible spectrum. So whenever we have a peak in the middle range, then we call that object green. So the leaves are green. Whereas for the strawberries, they reflect mostly the light in the long range part of the spectrum. So the strawberries appear red. So in our environment, we have some light source that is illuminating the scene. The light is emitting some kind of energy spectrum. It's falling onto the object. Some of the light is being absorbed. The remainder is reflected. It's entering or falling through the lens onto a sensor array or onto the retina, where this light is being measured. It's of course being measured by the retinal receptors. So we have the rods and the cones, and they absorb the light. We have three types of cones that absorb the light primarily in long, middle, and short range of the visible spectrum. Now, the problem that we have with measuring the reflected light is that the color temperature of sunlight varies throughout the day. So it won't help us very much to just measure the reflected light. So depending on the light source that exists in our environment, the measurement of the scene might appear different. So that these are examples of what the sensors might measure. And that's why we apply algorithmic processing to this information. So we as humans perceive colors as approximately constant. irrespective of the illuminant. So we are discounting the illuminant. So irrespective of the type of information that we measure on the left-hand side, what we perceive is shown on the right-hand side. Okay? So that obviously provides an evolutionary advantage. So now object recognition is much easier. So once we apply this color constant processing, then we just need to look at where's the peak, basically. Is the peak located in the middle range of the spectrum? Then it's green. If it's on the long range of the spectrum, then we call that object red. In 2007, I created this computational model for color perception. But there are, of course, other models around too. So this processing starts with the retinal receptors with an approximately logarithmic response. Then by the time we reach visual area V1, the coordinate system is being rotated. So data is basically being processed along the axis dark bright, red green, and blue yellow. Then within our visual area V4, we have, according to this theory, neurons that are laterally connected via gap junctions. And these gap junctions form a resistive grid. And this allows the neurons to compute local space average color. So basically, the color that's being measured is locally averaged. And the output of this is being subtracted from what's being measured. And if you do this subtraction, then you arrive at a color constant descriptor that is independent of the illuminant. Also, we have some temporal averaging going on before that. So now someone might argue, okay, but not everyone has 3 receptors. So of course, there are people with 4 receptors. Some birds also have 4 receptors. So the more receptors you have, the better your estimate of reflectance is going to be. And so, but it's not relevant. It does not matter as long as you've got 2 receptors. That's a minimum. So if you have 2, then you're able to get an estimate of this reflectance function. So it's still a one-dimensional function. And this result is grounded in reality. So different individuals all estimate reflectance. So color perception is comparable across individuals. So now, but this mechanism is not perfect. Sometimes it fails us. So let's have a look at color illusions. So this is Kitaoka color spiral. What we're seeing here, there are 2 color spirals. One appears greenish, the other one bluish, but they actually have the same reflectance. So in this image, there are only 3 reflectance values. So we have orange, pink, and a greenish blue. That's it. Now let's swap the inducing colors. So now we see that the color of the spirals appears to swap, but it just appears that way. So let's now remove the inducing colors. Now that's the actual reflectance. Okay? So, but if we take the original input and then apply some algorithmic processing, namely we apply a color constancy algorithm, then this is the output that we get. So this output was created by 2 of my PhD students, very bright ones, Ogusan and Dishlian Ulachan, I might mention. So that's the processing that our brain is performing. So I'm arguing that an organism capable of communicating what color it perceives at what spatial position relative to the head is perceiving the environment in exactly the same way that we do. So such an organism is estimating a 2D reflectance function. So basically that's a quale. So this function is, or the arguments to this function are the spatial position, x and y coordinates relative to the head. and the wavelength. And we're experiencing our visual environment in that way. We have a single screen view. We speak about things relative to the head. So in theory, we could address one part of the visual scene with one eye, like the sign, and some other part, like the car, with another eye, but we don't. The reason is because we communicate about this information. Also, of course, the receptors of the retina, they are non-uniformly distributed. So what we measure, or the data that we receive, is what appears in the center of this figure. So it's a non-uniform distribution. And the information that's being fed into V1 is what we see on the right half of this image. So that's the center image transformed or cut open and then stretched a bit. Also, of course, the eye permanently executes saccades. So we're addressing several different parts of the scene, one point after the other, non-uniformly measuring what is there. So our brain is performing a non-uniform sequential processing. So let's take a look at the sign again. So we have the 0 in the right half of the visual field that's being fed into the left hemisphere, and the 7 from the left part of the visual field is being fed into the right hemisphere. So, but our conscious perception is nothing like that. We have this unified field of view, and that's the function of x and y and lambda, the wavelength. So we could argue, well, why is it like that? It's like that because we're talking about what we experience to other individuals. So we could envision to just perceive our environment in a different way, like a depth map perception, where we perceive brightness, distance as brightness. So what's bright in this case is further away. Let's address sound. So we don't perceive sound as a spectrogram. So the top shows the wave form of the sentence, the sun is shining, and the lower part is the spectrogram that shows energy over time. We don't perceive sound like that. Why not? Because we are measuring or perceiving words in this case. Now let's address feelings. So we now I think we have a very good understanding of color, but what about feelings? Feelings, of course, have an evolutionary relevance. So let's just pick one. Let's pick hunger. What is hunger? And I'm arguing that this is possible to transfer this argument to other areas, to other types of qualia. So I'm arguing it's also a measurement. So what can we measure here? We can measure how the stomach muscles contract. We can obtain neural signals from the gastrointestinal tract. The level of nutrients in the blood can be measured. And of course, various hormones can be measured. So, of course, if you put all of that together, this information is likely a much, much more complicated function than the 2D reflectance function. Okay? And it may or may not be comparable between species. So, but I'm arguing that's what or why we are perceiving the things we are perceiving. Now let's turn to machine consciousness. So my main argument is that what is required is the ability to communicate, the ability to make measurements. So we need to make measurements about internal and external events. And we need, of course, need some memory to store perceived information so it's persistent. These requirements, these minimum requirements, might already be met by GPT-4's ability, for instance, to process incoming messages. So is GPT-4 or other large language models, are they conscious? And if so, what kind of quality do they experience? So of course, GPT-4 was created, so it's in a way different. It's not a product of evolution, so it does not, at least not yet, have a drive for survival. But what's interesting is it appears to have a theory of mind. So a couple of years ago, we did not really know how to implement any of this to get a machine to have a theory of mind. And now it appears that the theory of mind is also text-based, okay, it's language-based. So Bubak and others, they have investigated artificial general intelligence, and in particular GPT-4, and they've shown that it is able to use tools, very interesting. It's even able to transform text descriptions of an environment into a two-dimensional map. And of course, it does have a theory of mind. So that's very interesting, very nice. So maybe it's conscious, but maybe not. Is anything maybe missing? Do we not include something? Now let's have a look at the definition of communication. So according to Freeborn, communication involves an action or characteristic of one individual that influences the behavioral tendency, or physiology of at least one other individual in a fashion typically adaptive to both. So in a sense, maybe ChatGPT is just taking input, processing it, and outputting data. That's it. Because that part, influencing the behavior of someone else, is still lacking. So, but might not be long until we get there. So I'm arguing, or let's talk about qualia in machine consciousness. I'm arguing that possible robot qualia include color, 2D vision, hearing words and sentences. So if we establish an association, or these machines establish an association between spoken and written words. But no feelings, because that's a very much complicated measurement, which requires either a molecular signaling mechanism and or an evolutionary history that these machines will not have. So there won't be any pain, won't be any hunger, or won't be any love for the qualia in these machines. So to conclude, the Quale color is actually an estimate of the object reflectance function. It's a measurement about something in our environment. I'm not saying it's a perfect measurement, but that's what it is. It's grounded in reality, so it's comparable across individuals. And the Quale color is due to the mathematical structure of the space of reflectance. So it's spatial position and wavelength in a nutshell. And I'm expecting other qualia to be measurements too, although way, way more complicated measurements. And I firmly believe that machine consciousness is now a real possibility given the large language models. Thank you.